Hey there, Dr. Anna Maria Helt, herbalist and microbiologist with our Mushroom Monday mushroom. So this week I'm going to talk about the ubiquitous grocery store button mushroom and 6 things that you might not have known about it. Number one, those white button mushrooms you see at the grocery store are the same species as those little brown criminy mushrooms you see at the grocery store. They're both Agaricus bisporus, with Agaricus meaning gilled mushroom. It's kind of hard to see the gills on these guys because they're still immature. The gills are hidden under a layer of tissue. Now, both of these mushrooms, the buttons and the criminis, are also the same species as portobello mushrooms. The only difference here is that portobellos are allowed to grow up and become mature. And on these, you can now see the gills under the cap there as the mushroom grows and breaks that layer of tissue that protects the gills when the mushrooms are a baby. So portobellos and crimini are marketing things. They're fancier names for button mushroom. That is a slightly different color variant than the white mushroom. Now I see them listed as baby bellas in the store, and so all kinds of fancy names to make more people buy these mushrooms. So number 2, button mushrooms or crimini or portobellos are really nutritious. A lot of times, especially the white button mushrooms, they get a bad rap for being useless and not very nutritious, but actually they're nutritional powerhouses. They have a good amount of vitamin B12, which is good to keep in mind for vegetarians and vegans. They are very rich in vitamin D. They're high in zinc, they're high in selenium, and many other micronutrients. And not only that, they can contain up to 80% protein by dry weight. That's a big deal. That is a lot of bioavailable protein for us to eat. Again, especially if you're vegetarian or vegan. It's a great way to make sure you're getting some good protein in your diet. Number 3, they reduce blood sugar. So part of this might be due to their fiber content. Fiber helps slow the release of glucose, blood sugar, from our digestates, from the stuff that we eat. That translates to a reduced level of blood sugar circulating in the body and making things sticky and causing problems. The benefits that button mushrooms have on gut microbes from research also may contribute to a lowering of blood sugar, because a healthy microbiota in our gut, a healthy microbial population in our gut, is important for healthy blood sugar regulation. Button mushrooms may even increase the storage of our blood sugar in the liver. So glucose is converted into something called glycogen that gets stuck in the liver, and then when we really need it, when we really need a rapid release of sugar to run, to fight, to whatever, then that glycogen gets converted back into blood sugar again. But as long as that blood sugar is stored as glycogen in the liver, then it's not circulating around the body, which is another way that blood sugar levels may be lowered by button mushrooms. And then finally, there is some data suggesting that button mushrooms influence the secretion of insulin by the pancreas. So insulin is a hormone in the body that allows for different cell types in the body to take in blood sugar. When those cells do that, that also reduces the circulating levels. And so we do need blood sugar circulating around the body. Without it, we would die. It helps fuel our cells, but the problem becomes when we have too much circulating around, then we have issues, problems, because it is sticky and it can cause ultimately life-threatening effects. Now, number 4, button mushrooms, like many mushrooms, actually promote heart health and blood vessel health, cardiovascular health. So button mushrooms help to reduce blood pressure, and in lab studies they are found to contain ACE inhibiting activity. So ACE inhibitors are a well-known category of pharmaceutical drugs that are used for lowering blood pressure. Of course, button mushrooms aren't going to be as strong as taking a drug, right? So for people that have really skyrocketing blood pressure, eating button mushrooms is not going to be enough, right? But eating mushrooms as a regular part of your diet, together with the other things you're doing with your doctor, can be really helpful there. Also, button mushrooms have been found to support healthy blood lipid regulation. So we're talking about things like cholesterol and triglycerides and such. And part of that may come from the fiber content of the mushrooms. Part of it may come from the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties of the mushroom, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Also, some interesting studies in cell culture. Now, keep in mind that these don't necessarily reflect what happens in a person, but some interesting data from cell culture found that button mushrooms were able to reduce the stickiness of cells that line blood vessels. There's a cell type, a type of endothelial cell that lines the inside of blood vessels. And when there's chronic inflammation in the body, those cells lining the blood vessels express a higher level of adhesion molecules that grab onto things that are swimming by in our blood. So it could be cells, it could be platelets, it could be oxidized or sticky cholesterol. Those adhesion molecules can grab onto that stuff inside our vasculature and cause clogging. And so button mushrooms were found in these lab studies to reduce the production of those adhesion molecules in the cells that are the inner lining of blood vessels. And so that was really cool. One of the adhesion molecules for you nerds out there is VCAM. That was downregulated. Another one was ICAM1 that was downregulated, and another one was E-selectin-1 for you science nerds. So that's kind of cool. And you know what that means in a person remains to be seen. I alluded to this already, but number 5, button mushrooms actually help actually are antioxidant, I should say, so they can help reduce oxidative stress in the body. You can think of oxidative stress as basically rust. It's a similar chemical process. This is what I tell my students and my clients. So you can think of things that have antioxidant effects in the body, whether we're talking about a carrot, blueberries, or mushrooms, as Rust-Oleum for that rust in the body. So mushrooms, including button mushrooms, are comparable, if not even more strongly antioxidant in studies when compared to vegetables. So mushrooms in general can be a great addition to our regular diet. And then number 6, button mushrooms, like all edible mushrooms tested so far, whether in cell culture or further along those research pathways up into people, many mushrooms have anti-tumor effects. And so button mushrooms, there was a large population study done in Asia in women, and women who ate mushrooms regularly, and most of them were eating button mushrooms, had a lower risk of developing breast cancer. And so the researchers calculated that ingestion of on average 10 grams of mushroom a day was enough to be protective. 10 grams of mushroom is about the equivalent of half a sizable button mushroom. So not super high intake, but regular intake. And it's not like somebody sits down and eats half a mushroom a day. This is just what the average intake, say during a week, comes out to be. So that's pretty cool. Now, you know, population studies like that are correlative, and there can be issues in terms of data analysis and such, but still that's really interesting and hopeful. Now, there was a very small phase 1 trial, and phase 1 means, you're looking at a substance, checking to see if at higher doses it becomes toxic in people, seeing if there are any problems with administering that substance, and seeing if maybe there are some preliminary effects showing up. That's phase 1 study, so the kind of the earliest phase of a clinical trial. So there was a very small phase 1 study done in men with biochemically recurrent prostate cancer. What that means is their prostate might have been surgically removed or previously treated with radiation and such. Biochemically recurrent means that prostate cancer cells may be showing up elsewhere in the body, even if the prostate's gone. And this is measured in part by looking at the level of something called PSA, prostate-specific antigen. And so what it was found in this study is that administration of button mushroom powder was, for over 30% of the participants in this little study, enough to start bringing PSA levels down, suggesting some beneficial effects of this mushroom possibly in biochemically recurrent prostate cancer. So about 30% of the men in this very small study, let's see, how many, I'm looking at my notes, there were 36 men total treated in this study, not controlled, but in about a third of them, there was a measurable decrease in PSA levels. For 2 of the men, one who was taking 14 grams of mushroom powder a day and one who was taking 8 grams, PSA levels went to undetectable. No more prostate-specific antigen around. And so PSA, just to be clear, is made in the prostate and also made by prostate cancer cells. So their PSA went down the zippo in men that were previously treated for prostate cancer, by irradiation or chemo or prostate removal, what have you. In a couple other people, there was also very significant decrease in PSA down, but in a third of the study, there was some level of PSA decrease. So that's really hopeful. They didn't reach any toxic level of the powder that was administered in these men. And I've not seen follow-up to this clinical trial and say, a phase 2 or greater trial. Funding for those trials, they're expensive, and when you're going to do patent button mushrooms, there's maybe not a big financial motivation for somebody to carry this on as a clinical trial, but really interesting data nevertheless. And then there have been a number of studies. Let me think what all I want to talk about here, because I don't want this video to go on forever. There have been a number of studies in cell culture related to these observations with breast and prostate cancer. Cell culture, again, doesn't necessarily recapitulate the reality of a living, breathing, walking human being, but the data can be interesting nevertheless. So there is a dose-dependent inhibition by a water extract of button mushrooms of an enzyme called aromatase. So aromatase makes estrogen. And in estrogen receptor positive cancers, for instance, certain types of breast cancers, the tumor itself will induce local aromatase production. It's an insidious way that the tumor can stimulate its own growth via estrogen. And so, at least in the cell culture-based studies and test tube-based studies, button mushroom water extracts were able to inhibit aromatase activity in a dose-dependent manner. There was another study that also found various components of button mushrooms could inhibit aromatase activity, but these were sort of fat-soluble, or actually fatty acid components of the mushroom that were able to do this. So multiple constituents of button mushrooms may be able to reduce production of estrogen by this enzyme aromatase. So that's relevant to certain cancers, like certain types of breast cancer, potentially. And then some researchers found, in terms of the prostate cancer, that when we're looking in cell culture in dishes, that button mushrooms were able to influence the signaling in those cells via the androgen receptor. So the androgen receptor can get activated by an aggressive androgen known as dihydrotestosterone when it comes to prostate growth and swelling and prostate cancer and such. So button mushroom extracts were able to inhibit that signaling pathway, suggesting perhaps some mechanism of action for the data seen in that tiny phase 1 study. Now, there's some other cancer-related studies done in cell culture showing button mushroom to either kill or otherwise inhibit proliferation of a wide range of cancer cell types in a dish, and also to render a variety of cancer cell types in a dish more sensitive to various chemotherapeutic drugs. So that's also interesting. Again, how that translates to the reality in people remains to be seen, but interesting nevertheless. So my apologies to people that are not really into hearing about the science, but I like diving into it. Before wrapping up, if you've made it this long, I want to touch on a topic that's controversial that might be a worry to some of you, and this is related to a chemical known as agaritine, which is a phenylhydrazine derivative or chemical in button mushrooms, other agaricus species as well. So there's a controversy around agaritine and button mushrooms in cancer. And it was found that in some older studies, if you fed a large amount of button mushrooms to rodents, that they developed cancer. And agaritine took the blame. Now, there is a lot of conflicting data around this. For instance, there was a study that directly fed purified agaritine to mice, and they did not have a higher level of cancer than the control animals. There was another study that injected them with agaritine, and they also did not develop a higher level of cancer. But people still point to the feeding studies where they're like, well, maybe there's something else in button mushrooms that's causing cancer in mice, because when you feed them button mushrooms, they get cancer. But let's look at those studies a little bit more carefully. One of the feeding studies fed what turned out to be about 11 grams of raw button mushrooms per day for 3 days in a row, every week, for the lifespan of those mice. The average mouse is about 20 to 30 grams. They're eating 11 grams per day. They're eating a third to a half of their body weight per day, 3 days in a row, every week for their life. And the researchers concluded that the mushrooms cause cancer there. So here's the mouse. Here next to it is about 10 grams of button mushroom, 10 or 11 grams. Here's a person. Here's about how many button mushrooms roughly a person would have to eat to get the equivalent of this. So this would be me eating 40 to 50 pounds of raw button mushrooms 3 days a week, 3 days a row every week for my life. Shit. I wouldn't be surprised if I got cancer or a bad stomach ache or God knows what. So what does this study even mean? There's a similar study done feeding mice mass quantities of baked agaricus mushrooms to see if the same result would happen, feeding them ridiculous amounts 3 days in a row every week for the duration of that mouse's life. Results were similar, meaning that the mice fed the mushrooms developed cancer over time. And again, what does that mean? Unless you're somebody that's eating 30 or 50 pounds of button mushrooms every day, at least 3 days in a row every week for your life, I don't know that any real conclusion can be drawn from those studies with respect to human health. Now, if you are nervous at all about eating button mushrooms or other agaricus mushrooms, then skip them. Don't worry about it. Eat mushrooms that don't have agaritine or other, agaritine-related chemicals in it. I myself am not worried about it. I can't make that decision for you, but I'm giving you the information here. Don't take my word for it. Dive into the studies yourself and see what you think, because you'll see some papers and some writings warning you, and you'll see others that are like, it's not a problem. So you can look it up and decide for yourself. One last note before signing off. I do cook my mushrooms before I eat them because they're very hard to digest otherwise. The cell wall of mushrooms is made of chitin. It's the same thing that insects, their exoskeleton is made of. We don't really digest that very well unless it's been cooked. So cook your mushrooms. They taste better that way anyway. If you've made it this far, well done. Thanks for watching. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, just use the comment section. I look at all of them and respond. And so be well until next time.